So last week, my neighbor Rick asked me to help him pick out a brand new 75-inch TV. And he knows what I do here for a living, plus I've kind of been his TV guy for years now, so he definitely came to the right person. He had his heart set on spending $3,000 on Samsung's newest OLED because, in his words, I want the best. So we went to Best Buy, and 20 minutes later, he walked out with a brand new $1,200 mini LED that looked so much better in his sun-drenched living room than an OLED ever would have. And that's kind of the thing about TV shopping in 2025. The old rules as to which one is best isn't really as cut and dry anymore. LED TVs were the bright, affordable option for just kind of normal people. OLEDs were expensive, dim, and only made sense if you had a dedicated theater room with like blackout curtains. They were for enthusiasts. But now the gap between these has narrowed to the point where in many cases your viewing habits matters more than the underlying technology. But here's what hasn't changed. Despite all like the QLED, QD-OLED, Neo this, and Mini that branding, you're still choosing between two fundamental approaches to TV tech. You have OLED and you have LED. Everything else is just marketing designed to make you feel like you need the latest and greatest when you probably don't. So, is OLED still just for enthusiasts, and is LED still just the practical buy, or has that now flipped? And there's a lot to talk about here, so let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so let's start with OLED, where instead of a backlight, the pixels are their own source of light. Each one can turn off completely or blast at full brightness independently. It's elegant in its simplicity, which is why its contrast and viewing angles are stuff of legends. And I still remember when I first saw an OLED. It was in a dark room at Circuit City, which, like showing my age if the beard didn't already tip you off. But seeing true black for the first time on a TV was like a transcendent experience for me as a young man. Like, that was the first time that I got really, really into TVs. It was impressive then, and it still impresses me now. But TV technology has reached this weird inflection point where like both approaches are genuinely good at what they do. OLED excels at the things that it's always been good at, but now it's bright enough for most real-world situations in most rooms. The LG G5 that I tested earlier in the year hit over 2,200 nits in HDR highlights, which is genuinely impressive for OLED technology. That's like mini LED territory. A few years ago, getting an OLED over like 700 nits was considered a miracle. But today, that's still not most OLEDs. Cheaper models like the LG B series tops out at around 800 nits, which is perfectly fine for most situations, but it still is going to struggle in like a really bright room. The premium models will push way over 1500 nits sustainably with those insane HDR peaks that I mentioned. So when somebody says like OLED isn't bright enough, like you really need to ask them like which OLED that they're talking about. Now, burn-in is still theoretically, I guess, a thing, but it's become kind of like the TV equivalent of like range anxiety for electric cars. Technically, it's still possible, but practically it's gonna be pretty rare, unless you're doing something stupid like leaving on the news for like 24 hours a day for like 6 months at a time. It's not just bad for your TV, it's also gonna be bad for your brain. Now, I've had different OLEDs running in like my test setup like for years with varied content playing, and I've never seen permanent burn-in. Now, I've seen temporary image retention, but that kind of goes away with a few quick panel refreshes. Not that big of a deal. QD-OLED sets are slightly more susceptible to burn-in considering how like the technology of those works. But again, we're talking about like edge cases here. Samsung and Sony have implemented pretty aggressive pixel protection algorithms that shift the image slightly and like adjust brightness to prevent static images from like cooking into your panel. Burn-in is about as common as like Sasquatch sightings at this point. The lifespan question, however, is going to be more relevant with OLEDs. OLED panels, they do degrade over time, the blue pixels typically dying out first. But we're talking about like 20,000 plus hours of viewing before you'd notice like significant degradation over time. And that's like over a decade of like normal TV watching. So by the time that your OLED starts looking dim, you'll probably want to upgrade one anyway, because who knows what crazy technology will exist in 2035 for TVs. And not to be outdone, LED has gotten crazy sophisticated. Now, at their core, every LED TV is just gonna use a backlight that shines through filters and an LCD panel. So whether Samsung is gonna call it like QLED, Neo QLED, or decides to rebrand it as the Supreme Ultimate Quantum Neo QLED Pro Max Ultra next year, it's all still basically the same concept. Where the magic happens is how sophisticated that backlight has become. The traditional compromises that you're used to are so much smaller than what they used to be. In fact, most of those compromises are often imperceivable to the average person. Now, I've tested mini LED sets with like 4,000 to 5,000 individual dimming zones. That's basically like the higher the number, the more contrast that those LEDs can create on the screen. And 4,000 to 5,000 dimming zones creates a lot of contrast. So if you compare that to like one of like the early edge-lit TVs with like 0 dimming zones, you are going to understand why new LED TVs look so much better than what they used to. The best mini LED sets that I've tested a year ago get so close to OLED black levels that I have to pixel peep in order to see the difference. But here's the kicker. They do all of this stuff while pumping out 3,000 plus nits. It's sort of having like a car that's both fuel efficient and incredibly fast, which is kind of nice. LEDs over the years have just gotten insanely bright. The Sony Bravia 9, for example, is like having a sun in your living room. These displays can overpower almost any room lighting situation, which makes them bulletproof for bright living room spaces. Another example, the TCL QM8K was sustaining around 4,000 nits in my testing, which is borderline ridiculous. But that brightness translates to actual real benefits. HDR content is going to look very punchy and dynamic. Daytime sports viewing doesn't suffer from washed out colors. So if you've got like big windows or you got like lots of ambient lighting, LED's brightness advantages is undeniable. The contrast story with LEDs, however, is more of a spectrum. Cheap LED TVs will look a little bit washed out in like gray or dark scenes. So those $400 Black Friday specials that you're gonna see out there, they're using the basic same LED technology from like 5 years ago with like minimal local dimming zones. So you kind of get what you paid for with that stuff. But high-end mini LED sets with proper local dimming zones can produce blacks that get surprisingly close to OLED. Not quite there, but close enough that like most people who are buying these things are not going to care, especially like in brighter viewing environments where perfect blacks will just matter less. Now, if you put a high-end mini LED side by side with a high-end OLED in a completely dark room, the OLED is clearly gonna show shadow depth and detail a lot better. But when you turn on any sort of ambient light whatsoever, like how most people watch TV, the gap between those two technologies will narrow considerably. Viewing angles, however, will remain LED's Achilles heel. You sit too far off to the side and the colors will shift, contrast is going to drop, and everything just kind of looks like you're viewing it through like a dirty window. Some newer panels are much better at this. However, TCL, for example, has some really impressive viewing angles on their higher end sets, but at the end of the day, like they're never going to be as good as OLED. But this matters for more people than you think. If you've got like say like a big sectional sofa, so your TV is like maybe mounted in the corner, where people will sit at like varied angles. OLED's viewing angle advantages become really apparent in those situations. But if everyone just kind of sits mostly straight on, then LED is going to be perfectly fine. Now, when it comes to gaming, both technologies are going to be really great. Now, the days of having to choose OLED just for the lower input lag are completely over. Most decent TVs are going to hit under 20 milliseconds in game mode, and many are getting closer to those 10 millisecond thresholds. The Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 have made 120 Hz gaming completely mainstream, and both OLED and high-end LED supports it properly, and oftentimes going beyond that to around 144, maybe sometimes 165 Hz. Now, OLED is still going to have the edge with like pixel response times, which like matters for like competitive gaming. We're talking about the differences between like 0.1 milliseconds and 2 millisecond response time. So unless you're trying to like go pro in like Call of Duty or you play a lot of like fast-paced shooters, you probably won't really notice the difference. But if every millisecond matters to you, then you already know that OLED is going to be the way to go for you. But what matters more for most gamers is getting that 120 Hz support, variable refresh rate support, and enough HDMI 2.1 ports for all of your devices. Now, both OLED and LED camps are going to have good options with this. For example, the LG C5 has 4 HDMI 2.1 ports, which is fantastic. Some of the cheaper LED models are going to skimp in this area, only giving you like 1 or 2. So make sure that you just check the specs if gaming is really important to you. Now, to go through a few recommendations here, again, for OLED, the LG C5 is probably where most people should start. It's kind of the sweet spot of price and performance. It regularly drops under like $1,300 for a 55-inch model. It delivers everything that makes OLED special. And the processing is really excellent. It has all the gaming features that you want, and WebOS interface is actually pretty good these days. But if you want to go cheaper, the B4 series proves that you don't need to spend flagship money to get those sweet OLED benefits. It's definitely not as bright as the C5, but it's still OLED. You get the perfect blacks with really great viewing angles. Now, if you want to step up from the C5, the G5 uses LG's new 4-stack OLED panel technology that is genuinely brighter than previous generations. We're talking about like substantial improvements in HDR brightness, not just a minor bump. The downside to it is that it is significantly more expensive, and you're paying for a premium for what amounts to like a wall mount design and some extra brightness. For most people, I think the C5 is going to be the better value. value, but if you're looking for something like a QD-OLED, something like the Samsung S90F brings the technology down to more reasonable prices. Its brightness is more colorful than traditional OLED, though personally, I think the colors can be a bit oversaturated out of the box on that set, but you just turn it down a little bit. Not that big of a deal. The S95F, the one that I have here, uses an anti-glare coating, which actually works really well. So if reflection management is important to you, then this is going to be a really good option. Initially, I was pretty skeptical about matte OLED screens, but Samsung's implementation, it doesn't hurt the picture quality as much as I expected. It still looks sharp, it still looks great. Now, the Sony Bravia 8 Mark II is going to be my pick for movie enthusiasts. Now, Sony's processing, it's still going to be the best in the business for handling various content types and built-in surround sound system that is surprisingly good for a TV. Sony has this really cool or weird ability, however you want to think about it, to make lower quality source material look better than it should. So if you watch a lot of older movies or you stream content that isn't like mastered perfectly, Sony's processing magic is definitely worth the premium. Another one worth mentioning is Panasonic's Z95B, even if you haven't heard that name in a while. Now, Panasonic, they left the US market a couple years ago, but they have come back with some really impressive sets. Their picture processing focuses on accuracy over like wow factors, which appeals to certain types of viewers. But availability for these is going to be kind of still limited in the United States, and the price can be pretty steep. But if you can find one, it's worth picking up. Now, a couple recommendations for LED. The TCL QM6K might be like the best TV deal of 2025. And I'm serious, it's like under 800 bucks. You get like mini LED backlighting, you get the quantum dots and brightness that embarrasses TVs that cost like twice as much. Now, the set in the picture, it's not perfect. There's like local dimming algorithms that can be a little bit aggressive. And it's not the most color accurate, but it does get skin tones right. For the money, it's absolutely remarkable. The 65-inch version regularly goes on sale for under 700 bucks, which is a crazy good value. TCL's QM7K and QM8K are gonna be a step up in performance. If you wanna spend a little bit more money, you get better local dimming algorithms, you get higher peak brightness, and improved color accuracy. The QM7K is probably one of my favorite TVs to test because it punches so far above its weight class. Hisense's U8QG also impresses me with its gaming features and overall brightness, although sometimes that brightness can be a little bit too much, so you actually have to turn it down. But, you know, these are good problems to have. It's also really great for sports and action movies. Hisense has done a good job, and they've gotten really aggressive about improving their gaming features with high refresh rates and really low input lag. The U7N is also a good budget option and it still delivers that mini LED performance, while the U8N steps up in performance and the local dimming zone count. The Sony Bravia 7 brings Sony's legendary processing expertise to mini LED technology. Now, it's not going to be as bright as some of the other competitors, but its motion handling and upscaling are really excellent. If you watch a lot of like sports or maybe like older content, Sony's processing advantages have become really apparent over the last couple of years. And the Sony Bravia 9 is probably the best LCD TV that I've ever tested, like period. Like the local dimming is so good in that set that it generally rivals OLED in a lot of dark scenes. And the brightness capabilities of that set are just astounding. Samsung's QN80D is also a solid recommendation, even if it's a little unexciting. Like it does everything well, just nothing exceptionally well. The build quality, interface, and picture quality is all gonna be perfectly fine. But at Samsung's pricing, you can oftentimes get more exciting options from other brands. Samsung still does have the QN90D, which is better, but it's gonna cost significantly more. Samsung's QN900F also exists if you wanna spend like flagship money on an 8K resolution that you really can't use yet. I've seen it in person, it looks great, don't get me wrong, but there's virtually no 8K content that's gonna be available, and the upscaling benefits aren't really dramatic enough to justify the cost for most people, at least in my opinion. Now, I could go on and on with these recommendations, but these are just kind of ones that are like popping off the top of my head. If you have any other recommendations for sets that you love or prefer, let me know in the comments down below. I do read all the comments, and I'm genuinely interested in what you think and what you are excited about. So, with wrapping all this up, I want to go back to the intro talking about the story with my neighbor. When I got to his house, I asked him two simple questions that ended up saving him over $1,000. Where is this TV going, and how bright is that room? He wanted to replace his main set in his living room, and I already knew that he had the exact same west-facing windows that I did. And I also knew that he has like some weird vendetta against blackout curtains, and he didn't like matte screens on TVs. So that 77-inch $3,000 LG G4 OLED that he wanted it just simply wasn't going to work with that gigantic window. There was, however, a 75-inch, $1,200 mini LED that I already loved that was bright enough to overpower the sun, the TCL QM7K. Now, if he was putting this TV in like a basement theater room, or he didn't have like some weird secret hidden trauma from blackout curtains, I would have just steered him towards an OLED every single time. Perfect blacks matter more than peak brightness when you can sort of control the lighting even just a little bit. But in this situation, the LED was obviously going to be better despite costing less than half as much as the one that he originally wanted. And most people are like completely overthinking this decision. If your room gets bright during the day and you watch a lot of sports or like daytime TV, just get a really good LED TV. If you watch mostly movies at night or you have like really good lighting control, OLED's natural advantages are gonna shine right through. If you're somewhere in between, either technology is gonna probably make you pretty happy. Just don't get caught up in the spec sheet wars. Peak brightness numbers and contrast ratios only will tell part of the story. A TV that measures better on paper might actually look worse in your room watching actual content. The best TV is the one that works well for your specific situation, not the one that necessarily has the most impressive specs. And OLED, it just keeps getting brighter while the price drops. LED backlighting keeps getting more sophisticated every single year while staying relatively affordable, aside from maybe the $30,000 micro RGB LED TVs that you might see. But even those, the price will come down in time. All good trends for consumers. But for most people who are upgrading from their TVs that are like 5 or more years old, either path is going to be a massive improvement for you. Again, the key is matching the technology to your actual viewing situation, not chasing specs or brand names. Now, I've got all the links to all these TVs in the description down below, along with our other comparison videos that deep dives into specific models and these technologies. The TV market, it moves really fast, but understanding these fundamentals will help keep you from making some really expensive mistakes. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be just as happy as my neighbor Rick over there, who still texts me pictures of his football games looking absolutely incredible on that TCL QM7K that he wasn't even considering when he walked into Best Buy. But that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.